Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. Today's video is going to be all about testing in the Pokemon trading card game, trying to give you a step-by-step framework for which you can go through different stages of your testing, knowing that you're going in the right direction, making the most out of your time, and have a clear, distinguished goal in mind when you are playtesting to give yourself the confidence to feel tournament ready going into the upcoming tournament. This is hopefully going to be really helpful because the EUIC is upcoming, so it's going to also touch on brand new formats, but I also think this formula could be put into existing metagames, and in fact it's a lot easier in defined metas as they're described, because a couple of the stages are going to be much faster for you to go through, and in undefined metas it's somewhat of a educated guessing game, so a lot of time could be spent simply learning new archetypes, how they function and whatnot, and although that's helpful, that's not actually going to get you into that phase of testing, which we'll be going through in today's video. So I've tried to break your testing down into 4 main stages here, and this is going to be a progression. As you go through stage 1, you'll then move into stage 2, then stage 3, and finally stage 4 with a chosen deck of yours, but some of these do require certain upkeep. Certainly during a format, the sort of meta phase and the discovery phase will change tournament to tournament as we see new deck lists arise with different tech inclusions and whatnot. Your meta discovery phase kind of requires a little bit of upkeep, whereas there can be situations where certainly if you're sticking to a deck, the later stages can be fairly well set for you, and sometimes you're just having to refresh the metagame stage and then also look at how that affects your tech decisions. That is more so to do with defined metagames and as it sort of develops throughout the season, and if you're willing to just stick with a deck, roughly speaking, throughout that entire format, it's going to really reduce the amount of testing that actually you require, and also you can sort of compound your knowledge as you go. That could be a bit of a theme throughout today's video, but we are going to be breaking down these 4 stages in a lot more detail to be our framework to get ourselves tournament ready. So starting off with step 1, which is the meta discovery phase, is what I'm trying to call it, where we simply want to know what the metagame is. For those of you who don't know what meta sort of stands for, it is most effective tactic available. Essentially, these are the best strategies in the TCG to accumulate victories. We obviously have fantastic resources these days to make it very easy for us to keep an eye on the current metagame based on previous tournament results. Even into undefined metas, we now have city leagues that can also be found all in one place. The Limitless website is phenomenal for looking at in-person tournaments as well as city league data from Japan. So absolutely incredible resource for you. Everything I mentioned today is going to be linked in the description down below. And we want to start with just having a general knowledge of what the sort of top 10 or so decks are in the format. As you get more testing done, especially if there are some lower tier matchups that you're not sure about, sometimes it's worth exploring, further down the top 10, especially if we're in a wide metagame. If we're in a narrow metagame, certainly 10 is going to suffice in terms of what decks you're likely to face going into tournaments. Those are the ones worth researching. I think it definitely makes sense to learn the common counts within these decks, what their main strategy is, and some popular tech inclusions will open up or possibly close certain lines of play that are available to you. So simply doing your research of the best decks in the game is going to tremendously help the lines of play that you look towards when you're in an in-game situation. Finally, being aware of decks matchups is also going to be handy. There's of course Trainer Hill that does a great job of this for both in-person and online tournaments now. Having this overview of matchups can give us a great starting point before we enter our testing phase, because we can already highlight some matchups that we would like to test against, possibly tech against as well. And also having an awareness of what decks play well into others means that you can adapt during a format based on the perceived popularity. If a deck has been performing really well in the last few weeks, it's sometimes likely that will uptick in play. So trying to stay one step ahead of that shift in mentality from other players means you could pounce on a deck list that becomes better positioned than it has been in previous weeks. Like I said, generally this does require a little bit of upkeep from week to week based on the most recent regional results, but this is essentially looking at Limitless, taking in the data like a sponge, and getting yourself in that position where you could rattle off a standard 60 of some of the best performers, certainly the top 5 decks, so that when you are sat against them in tournament play, you have a general idea of what counts you need to consider. Now, this meta discovery phase is a lot more complex when we are entering a new format, because obviously a lot of things are changing, the card pool itself changes, changes, which means established archetypes are kind of being dislodged and will move around in terms of their playability. We generally want to think about whether decks benefit or lose out on either new inclusions entering the metagame or cards rotating, and in this case for the EUIC there are both happening in one go because we gain temporal forces and we rotate the E block. So with that, we want to have a general understanding of how the new card pool will inject strength or power or consistency or new options, new lines of play to existing decks in the game. But also, we want to know which brand new decks enter our metagame and how they play into the already existing archetypes. Just a very quick example for the E-block rotation. Obviously, we lose some decks all out. We lose Mew, we lose Rapid Strike Urshifu. God of War really gets gutted. It loses Fog Crystal, Battle VIP Pass, Level Ball, Shining Arcana God of War, Zacian V, Celebrations Mew. It loses so many things, right? So it's quite an obvious statement to say its own power level, its own consistency is dipping because you're losing essentially like 20 cards of what was previously a standard deck. With God of War, whereas something like Chien-Pao really didn't have to replace too many cards to the rotation. You get Buddy Poffin, which kind of means you get away without the VIP pass a lot easier than other archetypes because you are so reliant on evolving Pokemon like Bidoof and Frigibax. And you actually benefit from other cards rotating, such as Path to the Peak, where your own rulebox Pokemon, the Chien-Pao and the Greninja, a big part of your draw engine and how you gain consistency by thinning cards out of your deck with that Shivery Chill, now goes unchecked. Essentially, you can do this every turn of the game now, so you're much more likely to cycle into cards, have better ratios with your Pokestops and whatnot as the game progresses. So in a vacuum, the Chien-Pao deck is overall gaining from this rotation, most would say. Also, for undefined metagames in the West, we can look towards the City and Champions League results over in Japan. These are a fantastic resource to give us a starting point for our own testing. Obviously, it's a much more competitive casual player base, certainly at city leagues, because there are just so many of them from day to day in Japan. But these are still 64 player events and people are still obviously trying to do their best. So using the results from these tournaments is going to give us a really good baseline list of what are the most effective decks in the game right now. Of course, we don't have to take this information and say that this is exactly how our own metagame is going to shape up, but undoubtedly, looking at other players who have been playing in this format for many months, it would be absurd to completely ignore the general hive mind of activity that's been going on, because no doubt a number of these players will have already gone through possibly even the 4 stages of the metagame that we're going through today in some shape or form, so we'll have come to many conclusions about the format which we haven't yet done via our own playtesting. So piggybacking off of other people's work is a great way to give us a jump start into a format. At the same time, just looking on the surface of this data may also spark some questions and give you more direction towards your own testing if you're gravitating towards a certain deck and thinking about its own metagame placement within the Japanese city leagues, thinking why something's doing this well now, thinking why possibly something isn't doing as well as you would expect. These are definitely some things that you might want to just jot down on a notepad for you to then go back and test later on, to try and uncover some extra information that you may not have considered about how this new deck functions in the new format. So kind of towards the end of our metagame discovery phase, I think it's really worth jotting down what the top decks matchups look like into one another. Doing this traffic lighting exercise can be as arduous or as loose as you like. Once again, we can easily use the Trainer Hill data as our baseline when we are in defined metagames. But when we're going into a new format, I think you're going to have to do this a lot more based on your own theory, how you perceive the strength of decks into one another. Obviously, you could still look back at the previous format for a number of these archetypes, how the matchup used to play out, and then have a think about the new additions or losses that cards gain, and then make very loose estimates around how these matchups play out. The reason why we want to do this traffic lighting method, even though it is purely theoretical, is that it gives us a small basis to work off of, and we can essentially try and fill these gaps as we go with testing and improve on our own numbers, where we're converting our guesstimates into more realistic, genuine percentages as we get our playtesting done. Whilst at the same time, it means we can also create hypothesis based on these top performing decks, and could also give you some direction with what decks stand out to you as possibly well-placed archetypes in the format. This is also going to lead us really nicely into the second step of our testing. The example on the screen here, I really didn't spend too much time doing this. This was genuinely an exercise that took me like 15-20 minutes. I didn't even look at the Trainer Hill data, I just took some estimates. This was a couple of weeks ago as well, so this was really before I even started testing. It was really after just doing that theory of the gains and losses of other cards in the format, and generally having a perception of how these matchups play out in my head before I've sat down and played these decks into one another. Sometimes I also find it helpful to create a play percentage prediction as well. You can see that on the right-hand side of your screen with this pie chart. Well, I expect Charizard combined to be certainly the most popular deck going into the EUIC. I'd also expect a decent meta percentage of Lugia, Chien-Pao, Lost Box, and Snorlax. Slightly less, but still relevant percentages for the Lost Zone Giratina and Arceus Giratina variants. With a little bit more skepticism and less overall play rate for some of the newer archetypes, the future deck. Even though Roaring Moon is a currently well-performing deck, it does change quite substantially going into the new set, and the Great Tusk archetype, with also some leeway for other decks to roam around the format as well. Again, this can be more loose, but if you are going to think about what decks are best placed, it's really helpful to weight your decision based on the popularity. It certainly seems more relevant to have a good matchup into Charizard than it would be to be very, very favoured into Great Tusk, because it's much more likely you'll face multiple Charizard in a day in the EUIC than it would be to hit more than one Great Tusk. So having some bias, some weighting towards the higher tier decks in the format and how your deck choice plays into those is also a really important thing to keep an eye on here. The next step is to focus in on deck or decks. Anything within the top 10 decks has potential to win or perform well at the next event. And we can say with pretty good confidence that that's going to be the case. We've seen over and over again in City Leagues, there's been hundreds of them now, that all of these archetypes have shown up frequently, have won a number of these City Leagues in their own right, that they are all at a strength, at a power level that they can perform well if you give these decks enough testing, pilot them correctly, and put more time into that archetype. So if any of those top 10 decks has the potential to do well, how do we narrow down our choice down to just one or two archetypes? Firstly, it's really helpful to consider the decks you've already got experience with. You've probably already got a fantastic knowledge base of certain archetypes, ones that you've played at previous tournaments, and keeping these archetypes as considerations makes a huge ton of sense here, because you drastically reduce the amount of learning time that you need to adjust to the changes within your deck list. Typically, new archetypes are only having a handful of cards introduced, compared to picking up and learning an entire new archetype that you haven't got any experience with. This is one of the most important points, that you are having such a great time save if you are choosing an archetype that you have already played a decent amount with. I'd also say that knowing your own preferences or biases when choosing a deck will also immediately eliminate a number of archetypes for a number of players, be it they're sort of intimidated by playing certain stressful or difficult or resource intensive or sequence heavy archetypes, be it they simply just don't vibe with controlling decks or don't like playing stage 2 decks, or if they lean towards playing hyper aggressive archetypes, or on the flip side, if they really like having comeback mechanics and using the likes of Iono to handlock opponents in the later stages. Knowing your own preferences is also going to help really direct and eliminate essentially archetypes that you don't necessarily enjoy or feel like that you'd have a good time playtesting. Knowing that we want to commit a decent number of hours to playing this archetype means that you're going to have a better time if you're enjoying your time as you do so. That also quite nicely leads into that third point of being honest about your own ability and how much time you can commit to playtesting. That means that, again, you might want to rule out a number of archetypes yourself if you're a lesser experienced player, or know that they require all sorts of different skills to maintain all in one archetype and it's overawing. You can immediately eliminate them from your own deck choice. And also be aware that if you commit a certain amount of time between now and the EUIC, how many decks can you commit time towards testing? Anytime you're testing an archetype that you eventually sack off and then jump onto another archetype, you're losing a huge chunk of time. And honestly, there's not that much time now until the EUIC. So my general advice would be to stick to one or two archetypes and use this time very effectively to get very confident in your ability with those one or two decks. And that brings us on to that sort of traffic light exercise and that play percentage prediction that we did in the previous stage, only if we still have multiple options available to us after we've gone through those first three on the checklist. I think many players highly weight their deck choice based on this prediction, but at the end of the day, we haven't done our testing yet. We're only based off theory and making educated guesses. Even if we are experienced players, these are still guesses at the end of the day, and I think the 3 points above it are still going to be the most important in terms of finding a successful deck for you. I'm going to say it once again because I do think it's really important to say that any of the top 10 decks right now are good choices for a tournament if you're experienced with them. And then finally, if you want to go rogue, that's up to you. Just know that you're giving yourself so much more work because you're doing all the testing yourself. You have very little experience that you can draw on from other places. And I would actually go one step further in saying that in undefined metagames, this is almost impossible to get entirely correct because you have to make so many assumptions about what's going to be popular, what the best ways to build decks are, how the metagame is going to shape up, and adjust your archetype according to those percentages. You're really leaving a lot up to chance, and your deck could ultimately be much less optimized than some of the currently best performing archetypes out in Japan. Let's try and put these points into action then with a couple of examples. In this one, there's a player who's been playing Lost Box since the start of the season. They know that they don't want to play rare candy decks and they don't want to play control for 9 rounds, and they feel confident and capable of piloting complex archetypes, definitely managing resources like Mirage Gate and Super Rod and whatnot, and can sequence well with that archetype and have enough time to test matchups and techs. Straight away, we know that they won't want to be putting much time into control or the rare candy decks because that's going to lead them to having a bad time and not enjoying their testing process and possibly giving up midway through. And by far the most time efficient thing you can be doing is continue with what you know, because they are still high-tier decks in the metagame. Lost Box has been doing very well out in Japan, as has Lost Zone Giratina. These would be the archetypes that I would suggest to begin your playtesting with, because you already know the general sequencing, as well as like the macro game plans of these decks quite well. So even when you are coming up against new lists and new archetypes, you generally know how your opening turns play out, what a good opening setup looks like, and what your priorities within your own deck list should be. A second example, and unfortunately quite a sad one for a number of players, is that if you've been experienced with an archetype that no longer looks playable, and this is Gardevoir for a number of people, it seems to have dropped off massively in terms of its win percentage. So in this situation, it feels like it's correct to abandon the Gardevoir deck, unfortunately, and then look towards playing a new archetype in the new format. So again, think about your own preferences. In this case, they enjoy playing longer games. They like to have one prize board states that they can use to get up trades or pull their way back into games. And they want to have hand disruptors at their disposal. And that final crucial point, they only have around 10 hours to commit before the EUIC. And really, the less time you have to commit to testing means that I think you should look higher and higher up the tiers here of the best decks in the game. Because once again, you're piggybacking off of the huge number of other players who are already playing those archetypes. And you know that they're already at a generally very high power level. So even if your testing is quite limited, as long as you know what you're doing with your own archetype, generally speaking, in terms of how you try and get the optimal setups, you're still able to get really reasonable results with your deck. In this exact case, where we're looking to have sometimes fully one prize board states and have some hand disruption at our disposal, I would definitely suggest Charizard Bibarel and Lugia Archeops, with the new Cinccino being this great single prize beat stick, probably the best one in the game that we have going into the new format. Both of these archetypes do play multi-prize Pokemon, but they also can find board states, certainly towards the mid-game, where you only have single-prize threats. And both these archetypes are playing fairly heavy counts of Iono, typically 3 in both of these archetypes, actually. So you know that you can try and catch your opponent out towards later stages of games and put them in really awkward positions. So even though you're no longer playing Gardevoir, you're still using your experience with another deck and trying to replicate your knowledge from another archetype and use your sort of playing experience to reshape it and recreate those board states with a different deck. So after stages 1 and 2, it's finally time to get down to some play testing. Ideally, you've got 1 or 2 decks in mind that you've honed in on that you want to begin your play testing with. From here, we want to create some vanilla deck lists and begin testing our matchups. Again, using previous tournament results, we can create standard 60s for the top decks in the format. I did a really handy video on the statistically best decks of Temporal Forces that I'm going to also put in the link in the description below. You can use this to create really easy skeletons for standard lists going into the new set. These are all based off the City League data, so again, we're taking the resources that are available to us to create at the very least functional and consistent lists. When we're in a defined metagame, we can quite easily again look back at previous tournaments and simply take lists that have been high performing and again use those to be the basis. But in this case, we're going to have to use our own initiative here with the City League data and make our best guess of what decent 60s look like. If you're still relatively unfamiliar with a deck, don't begin recording the win rate with your first few games of the deck. Just focus on learning how the engine is, how the deck functions, and how it looks to create favorable prize positions, and generally what good early game board states look like for the archetype. This is much more of like a learning phase rather than a testing phase. So I don't think it's valuable to look at win rate as your picking up and learning a deck, it's basically going to skew your data unfavorably for the archetype and either makes you underestimate the deck when you play against it because you're unfamiliar with it and then therefore play it badly when you're playing another deck against it, or that early win rate puts you off the deck entirely and you essentially overlook what could be a well-performing archetype if you get enough reps in with it before you begin testing. When we are doing this exploring phase with new archetypes, I definitely suggest playing against a deck that you do know, so at least you're playing one side very correctly and putting the new deck in difficult positions as much as possible, throwing everything you can at it. Or if you're still unfamiliar with the majority of archetypes, throw it against something that's top tier, so at least you know it's going to be a matchup that's worth exploring again in the future, and getting some early reps against that one matchup is usually going to be useful to you. The goal of our testing in step 3 is to get a better picture of those matchups. That traffic light that we did just based entirely on theory is nice, but it's not as good as getting the concrete numbers based on your own playtesting. When we are doing this vanilla list testing, again, I would always prioritize playing against the high tier decks of the format and then look towards your traffic lighted perceived to be difficult and find out just how bad they are. Is it literally a dodge and weed matchup that you cross your fingers not to hit? Or are there certain lines of play or potential techs that you could think about that could work in certain situations within games that could bump up or bolster your win rate? If you are thinking of tech cards as you are going through games, certainly put a pin in that and make a note of it during your games, but I wouldn't jump to making huge changes and cuts within the list while you're going through these steps. I would only really look to make 1 or 2 card changes if, as you start playing with a standard 60, you start noticing that cards really aren't being played all that much, aren't finding themselves too useful, or you generally just want to bump up consistency by bolstering consistency counts within your list. Let's again take an example. This is the traffic lights that I did for the Lost Giratina deck, and I felt like just from the offset, in theory, I don't like my time into Lugia because they have V-Guard energy as well as Mist energy, so they can make it difficult for me to get KOs with my Giratinas into their multi-prize Pokemon, and they have Cinccino which can uptrade into my multi-prize Pokemon. Mist energy can also protect them from a Greninja plus Sableye combo that we can look for, and they're rocking heavy counts of gift energy, so my hand disruption late game is usually not going to be that effective. I've also noted the Lost Box matchup can be tricky. They can really dictate their prize map a little bit easier because they can put multi-prizes into play as and when they're required, whereas the Giratina player, in order to make use of their multi-prizes, they have to be on the board for larger periods of the game and can give the opponent more avenues to take multi-prize turns. Also, again, without Path of the Peak anymore, our hand disruptors are far less effective because oftentimes a Radiant Greninja will be on the opponent's side of the field, and they oftentimes have emergency board at their disposal to have some more on-board protection to our hand disruptors. So that was the very basic theory that I did for the worst matchups for Tina going into this new format. Now let's have a look at my priority in terms of games. I'd start by testing against the high tier decks. So I'd put 6 games into Charizard Bibarel, 5 games into Charizard Pidgeot. That's a total of 11 games into Charizard, which I think is a really good amount to get a view of how the Zard matchup goes, as well as the nuances between a Pidgeot and the Barrel build, because both of these engines seem viable. Also, I'd want to put 7 games into Lost Box. Not only is it high tier, but it's also a matchup that I'm not that confident into, so I want to try and identify lines of play that could give me a better chance into this matchup. At this stage, we can assess whether we want to continue. If we feel fairly confident with our win rate into the Charizard players, and feel fairly okay with the Lost Box matchup, then I'd move on to the other perceived worst matchups, the Lugia matchup. If I wasn't content with my matchup into the high tier stuff, at this stage it might be worth jumping ship. You've committed a decent number of games into a deck, but it's still recoverable and you likely still have enough time to try a different archetype instead. If you're then going to your next stage of your testing with Giratina, then you look to play against the Lugia matchup, figure out how good or bad it is. Again, maybe make some notes, think about things like Temple of Sinnoh being a possible tech inclusion and how that could change your matchup. And again, have that situation of choosing whether or not to carry on playing Giratina. It's really important to not get discouraged when you play into your bad matchups and still know that the deck generally has a number of good matchups that you want to face. So it does require decent willpower to stick with an archetype even though you've just played a number of games into one of your worst matchups and have a fairly low win rate. You then close out your testing by playing a decent number of games into the lower tier stuff that you still feel relatively confident in. And at that stage, in this example, I'm saying 55 total games is a reasonable amount. It's easily going to take you 10 plus hours to get these 55 games in, but in doing so, you will have transformed your theory-crafted traffic light system into actual win percentage for the deck. Yes, in a number of situations, these are still going to be low numbers of games, but this is going to really help inform our 4th stage of our playtesting, and it's going to give us a great overview of how the deck performs into the wide field. At this stage, things I've mentioned actually starting to play some games, let's quickly steer away from the 4 steps and quickly talk about the methods of playtesting. We really want to be making the best use of our time in this stage, because the more testing you do and the speedier you can do your testing, the more information you can gather before the tournament itself. So not only does creating this framework help you, but also being efficient within your time spent playtesting is going to give you the most information with the deck that you're playing to have a well-rounded picture of how your deck is functioning. So in my eyes, there are 3 ways of testing, and all of these have their strengths and weaknesses. We have the Limitless Simulator, we have playing on PTG Live, the ladder, and we have in-paper play. There are going to be nuances with all of these, so let's get into detail about each of them. We'll start off with Limitless Simulator. This is by far the most efficient means of testing a sheer number of games. I feel like you can easily get 5 games in within an hour when you are playing on LimSim, so it's a fantastic way to churn out just a huge chunk of games all in one go. You're getting to choose your matchups and the deck list, so you know that you're going to be playing relatively consistent lists into one another to get a good understanding of how consistent the archetypes are, and you're not wasting any time by playing matchups that may be less relevant to you. You can also take back mistakes and try different lines of play and then reverse the board state and see how different you would end up if you had taken a different line during a game. This is actually really handy for figuring out the optimal lines into certain matchups. Because everything is quite manual on Limitless Simulator, you can physically just pull cards back and put yourself into a state where you were before, sometimes even screenshotting the board state, then going through a couple turns and then rewinding to that previous point is very easy as well, and you can really get into the nitty-gritty of how you should put yourself in the most winning position. You can also easily stream on Discord and discuss plays without a clock forcing you to make actions, which would be the case on PCGL. So you can have much more easy discussions with other players, your friends, your coaches, etc., and then you can try and work towards certain game plans in matchups more freely. You can also simply just goldfish on Limitless Simulator, which is really good for certain combo decks, just to see how consistent decks are for the opening turns of games. There's certainly a number of decks in this new format that I've put time goldfishing into, certainly how Lugia performs and how consistent its turn 1 and 2 combo is. I've definitely done the same thing for Chien-Pao as well in previous formats. And once again, if you're a newer player, just learning the sequencing of your first couple turns is a fantastic practice to do, just to get into the mindset of the deck and how it wants to be setting up in most ideal situations. The only real disadvantages of Limitless Simulator is that it doesn't help good in-person, in-paper habits, and it doesn't give you any insight into how a best of 3 50 minutes will go, because timings are completely thrown off here. So you could feel happy winning a best of 3 on Limitless Simulator, and then come to discover that the game actually goes quite long, and you need to have a much more inflated win rate into that matchup, because otherwise you might end up tying into a matchup that you'd expect to be winning more often than not. And the other small thing that can creep into your testing is that your awareness of your own hands and the deck lists could lead you to certain biases. Playing around certain counts can give you definitive yes or no, this is the best play in this situation, whereas playing an enclosed deck list situation can throw more question marks into your play. And this is all part of playing in tournaments where you're trying to weigh up the possibility of opponents having certain tech cards or certain counts within their deck list before committing to certain lines of play. Moving on to the PTCG Live ladder, I still think this is more efficient than in-paper play in terms of the amount of games you can actually play when you are engine testing a deck or learning it for the first time. Once again, you're not doing all the shuffling yourself, and you can simply be clicking through, and all the automation means that you can speed through games pretty happily on PTCGL. Also, PTCG Live is closed deck lists and removes any bias, so you are forced to play around the general counts of decks, but also a handful of techs that they could feasibly play within the deck, and that's a skill that you have to learn when we're in tournaments. A kind of good and bad situation is that there is a clock forcing you to play actions in a reasonable amount of time. This is something you'll have to do when you're actually at tournaments, so it is a handy skill to learn, but it does also limit the amount of discussion you can have with people and could force you into lines of play that you don't necessarily want to make because you're forced to make an action at the time that then ends up not being the best choice for you as your turn or your match actually develops. You also don't have much idea of how skillful your opponent is or how good their deck list is, so things could be working out for you on PTGL when better players could be deck thinning more correctly or making different lines of play to create a more difficult prize map for you. The one caveat to this is that the more you play on PTGL, the better the ladder's going to be for you, because ideally you're ranking up as you play more games of PTG Live, so you put yourself into a category where you're up against other tryhards like yourself. The main downsides of PTG Live is that you can't take back any mistakes, and you can't really reverse board states. If you make a mistake, or if you want to try something different, you need to go back into the ladder and try and hit the same matchup again and wait till that same situation arises, and that can take untold amounts of time. That situation may never arise again, and you don't necessarily have that sort of coulda, woulda, shoulda moment that you can see how it would have played out if you take a different direction. Also, because you're not choosing matchups, you could very much be wasting time. How many times have you loaded up onto PTG Live, you face a deck that you have no idea what's going on, and you're never going to see that one again, but you still have to sit there for 10-15 minutes as you actually play through the motions and go through the matchup, because conceding puts you even lower on the ladder and you don't want to keep facing bad decks, so you need to try and actually beat this random rogue archetype, and it's essentially just a distraction from what could be useful time spent playing a real matchup. Also, once again, PTG Live doesn't help you with that timekeeping process and doesn't teach you good in-paper habits, and these are still core skills in the TCG. So finally then, we do have in-person play, and this does teach all those good IRL habits. Learning good habits is actually really important for newer players because you don't want to be using mental energy just thinking about these things that are now robotic to more experienced players, maintaining a tidy board state, shuffling in a timely and effective fashion, doing your prize checking, all of these sorts of things we can take for granted as players who have played for a decent amount of time, but for beginners can be overawing to try and juggle whilst also trying to play your deck at your best capacity. So the more you play IRL, the more these actions become second nature, the easier they are for you to do, and they essentially just become robotic actions that you do inherently without investing mental energy towards them. This is also going to give you great awareness of how a best of 3 in 15 minutes can work. You can literally time yourself when you're playing in person against someone else, and it means that in certain situations you can identify when it is best for you to scoop advantageously to try and get that third game in if you think it's a positive matchup for you. When we're in tournaments, this can be a more stressful situation, but having a general outline of how long a matchup plays out can once again give you a better informed decision for when you are thinking about conceding. Another strength of playing in person is that you can make those takebacks, you can try different lines of play and reverse board states and put yourself back in a position where you were a couple turns ago, and you can try doing things a little bit differently. The downsides of playing in person is that it's really inefficient for the huge volume of games we want to be playing if we want to get this great overview of your deck against the general field. It's difficult to get 3 games within 50 minutes in many occasions in the Pokemon TCG, especially if we are discussing openly lines of play, looking at the opponent's hands, looking at your own, looking at the best optimal turn for them compared to the best optimal turn for you, discussing lines of play and what you could be doing in these situations. Oftentimes a best of 3 is going to go over an hour, which takes far, far longer than just jamming the same game on Lim Sim or even on PTG Live for friend battles. And with that as well, those biases can sometimes leak into your own gameplay and make you make these choices based on known counts within the list. So my general breakdown for these different types of testing really comes down to you as a player and where you are in the game. I think if you're experienced or you test with an experienced friend group or a coach, Limitless Simulator is absolutely busted. There's no trumping it because you can test so many games as quickly as possible. And I suggest that that should be the bulk of your pre-tournament prep, and you only really use the other things to supplement the games that you're playing, and committing as much time as you can to Limitless Simulator or the other simulators that we have access to, because you can simply just jam so many games. If you're in that stage where you're still learning a deck, how it functions and what it's like and what you should be doing with it, this is where PTG Live comes in, and I think it's a great engine test because you're still getting a decent number of games in, but it's not necessarily all on you to figure everything out. Your opponent's doing their turn, it gives you time to think, you're not getting overall trying to play 2 decks at once, and you can really just focus on yourself and your own gameplay. So I think it makes it much easier to digest as you are getting your first few games in with the deck before you then jump into Limitless Sim and start recording your games a lot more accurately. And then finally, for in-paper play, I think this is really pointless for experienced people, but it's an absolute must for those who are still lacking in tournament experience, because you're learning these habits and you're becoming well versed in real life play, which is going to make you feel much more confident, much more able, and again, you're not trying to juggle all of these things that you're trying to pick up at the same time as trying to play your deck to the best capacity. If this becomes second nature, it means you're only focused on making the best choices at the time, and you're naturally doing your shuffling well. You can even think while you shuffle and your hands are just moving on their own. You're going to have that clear communication with your opponent. Your actions are going to be clear. Your board's not going to be messy. It's going to make life easier for you and your opponent, so there are no issues during game in terms of gameplay errors or breaking the board state or anything like that. Hopefully, by being clear and communicating your actions with your opponent, it means they can pick up on things if you're not able to do them, like play a second supporter card, attach an extra energy, bump a stadium that you've already done that turn. All of these things, if you're being clear with your communication and having a neat board state, it should be much easier for you and your opponent to pick up on these things as you go, so you're just naturally playing the game better. It also means that you're considering things like prize checking and time management as you play your games as well, which ultimately every now and then can turn ties into wins or losses into ties. These things are still really important for achieving really good records at the high level. Ultimately though, any of these things are helpful and are still going to be good, so don't feel bad if you are sleeving up all these decks and whatnot and just jamming games against your friend. We're still having fun at the end of the day, and playing any games is still better than playing no games, so whichever one of these takes your fancy could still be the best choice for you. Congratulations, we've made it to step 4, where we're talking about tech decisions and those final counts within your list. Honestly, just getting to this step should equip you pretty nicely for a tournament. We should be feeling pretty comfortable with the deck's playstyle and have a really good idea of its matchups into the other top decks in the game. Throughout those 50 plus games of your playtesting, you've probably already picked up on which cards aren't pulling their weight within your deck list, if any, and you might even have an idea or two about things you might want to try within your list as well. If you found a matchup difficult in your playtesting, or based on your metagaming, if you expect an even matchup to be very popular, think about which techs you could fit into your deck to improve that matchup. Then of course we've got to get back to that testing, we've got to try that matchup, see how the tech functions, see the results, and repeat with other techs if necessary. If you find that one or two card techs can't swing a matchup effectively, or if the meta's wide, you may feel like it's not worth committing tech space because you still may only face that deck once or twice within your 9 rounds, I would always lean towards playing consistency cards over techs. Some other general advice for teching is that you really don't want to commit many spaces within your deck list. Whenever you open your first hand of Pokemon, you always want it to be playable. How many games have been won or lost because you couldn't do anything on the first couple turns of the game? There's once again no worse feeling than being in a situation where you need to top deck a good card to play the game, and you see that one tech inclusion that does nothing for you, you end up scooping to game 2. You always want to have a gluttony of consistency cards in your deck, because at the end of the day, you almost always need your deck to function before any of these tech cards even come into effectiveness. At the same time, more flexible tech cards are better than like hard techs just for one matchup. If you can find a card that gives you a little bit of a boost into one matchup but also has other utility here and there, these are going to be much more valuable cards within your deck list, because simply for more rounds, it's going to be a useful card in your list, rather than a card that simply is here for one purpose only, and it's on turn 4 in this one matchup. Because every other situation that you see this card, it's going to be a brick for you. I would also avoid teching in lower consistency or combo-based decks and accept the matchup spread as it is. When you're playing these decks that want to just stick to their ratios and have a game plan in mind based on pulling off a combo, you don't want anything to distract from that. You simply want your deck to do the thing as much as possible, because that's inherently the win rate of the deck right then and there. There are archetypes in the format right now, like Lugia and Chen-Pao, that basically do nothing if they don't get their engine, so tech cards are really unadvisable compared to just filling your deck out with cards that help you get into the game. Let's also talk about some tips to help you through those steps 3 and 4 of your actual playtesting within games. You really want to be playing without distractions if you can, and record your win and loss. You can happily do this on an Excel spreadsheet. There's also a couple websites, I'm going to link them all in the description below. Counterplay.gg is in its beta stage, but it can be a fantastic resource for you. You can paste in your PTGL game logs, and that's going to do all the data for you. Essentially, having this information to look back on, especially with notes that can help you along the way, can help distinguish patterns between why you won and why you lost, and how the matchup plays out generally. And you can also notice situations where you found a new line of play, and then notice from that point onwards how your win rate differs. Also, within your notes and within your testing, I do think it's really good to note the sort of least helpful, the least frequently used cards in your decks. These are your most flexible spots within a list that you can change into other better consistency cards, or for those 1 or 2 techs, should you choose to add them into your list. I also think it's really helpful, once you've done this playtesting, to create a matchup guide for your deck. At this point, you can simply see if you've won more games or lost more games by going first or second in the matchup, or once again use your theory to think about what's preferable to you to go first or second in each matchup, have an idea of your most common prize or turn map, and also be aware of how your opponent's prize map will go based on what deck they're playing. Circling back to step 1, know the common tech cards within the most popular decks in the game, how it can affect your deck and your prize map, and also have a general understanding of the high and low priority cards in the matchup for potential discard fodder or prize checking, what's going to be most important to access quickly. An obvious example would be that if you're up against a Giratina Fodder, a Goldengo, a Lost Box, knowing where your mana feet is if you're playing an evolving deck. Whereas in other matchups, it could easily just be discard fodder. If you're finding it tough to create this matchup guide for a certain archetype, that's also giving you information that you don't know the matchup well enough, want to grind some more games, and can come back once you've had more games against it. So to summarize then, if you use this 4-step framework, you should be very aware of the metagame and how the popular decks function and how they're built. You should feel confident in your ability to pilot your deck and have experience playing against the other top decks in format, so you shouldn't be caught off guard in too many situations in a tournament setting, and you have previous experience to draw off of when you're put in various situations in game. You should have those game plans outlined and prepared for the best and most popular decks. No 2 games of Pokemon are the same, but there will be general patterns of play if both players are getting fairly well set up in games. So if you have played these matchups a decent amount, you again should be identifying the best plays for you during individual turns. And you should also have scrutinized your 60-card list and evaluated these counts based on your own testing, with general prejudice against hex being pro-consistency unless the expected format demands you to play 1 or 2 cards to improve matchups that you're expecting to hit, or that you really don't want to lose against. I hope you found this video helpful. If anything was too complicated or if there's anything you'd like to add, certainly join the discussion down below. I really want this video to be a hub for playtesting and a really good baseline and framework for people to take on. Ultimately, it's a 4-step plan that's ideally helping you hone in towards 1 or 2 decks that you playtest really nicely and have great experience with. So at the very least, you can be happy that you're playing to the best of your ability and don't have many distractions as you're practicing the new format. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Let me know your thoughts down below, and I'll see you tomorrow for another one. Cheers.